You think you know what you want. Your taste in food, the brands you trust, the causes you care about. You think those preferences came from somewhere inside you. Edward Bernays spent 70 years proving that's more complicated than it sounds. In 1928, a man published a book called Propaganda. The opening argument wasn't a warning, it was a business plan. He wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country." His name was Edward Bernays. He wasn't ashamed of this. He was describing his profession, and he was very good at it. This is the story of the man who helped corporations learn to sell not products, but desires, not features, but identities, not ingredients, but what it means to be American. Edward Bernays was born in Vienna in 1891. His mother was Sigmund Freud's sister. His father was the brother of Freud's wife. He was Freud's nephew twice over. The family moved to New York when he was a year old. He studied agriculture at Cornell, became a journalist, then a theatrical publicist, and then the First World War changed everything. During WWI, Bernays served on the United States Committee on Public Information, the government's propaganda operation. Its job was to bring American public opinion behind a war most Americans didn't want to fight. Through posters, speeches, newspapers, and film, it worked. Bernays watched the entire operation from the inside. When the war ended, he asked himself one question. If mass persuasion could move a nation to war, why couldn't it move consumers to a product? In 1919, he opened the first office calling itself a Public Relations Council. He read Freud's general introductory lectures, a gift from his uncle, and adapted a single idea. People's choices are driven by unconscious desires, not rational thought. Advertisers of the era sold products by describing them. Bernays understood something further. The product was never really the point. The desire was the point. If you could attach a product to a desire someone already had, you didn't need to convince them of anything. They would convince themselves. In 1923, he published Crystallizing Public Opinion, the first textbook on public relations. In 1928, Propaganda, the explicit manifesto. His clients included the American Tobacco Company, Procter & Gamble, General Motors, CBS, and the United Fruit Company. He was building something, and it is still being used today. In the 1920s, the Beech Nut Packing Company had a problem. Americans had shifted to lighter breakfasts, coffee, toast, maybe cereal. The old heavy meals, the kind that had sustained farm laborers in the 19th century, had given way to something faster, thinner, less demanding. Beechnut's bacon wasn't selling. They hired Bernays. He didn't run an advertisement. He did something more careful. His public relations firm had a doctor on staff. Bernays asked this doctor a specific question. Is a heavy breakfast healthier than a light one? The doctor said yes. The body loses energy during sleep, and a larger meal in the morning helps restore it. Bernays then had that doctor write to 5,000 of his physician colleagues, putting the same question to them. 4,500 wrote back. A hearty breakfast was better. This was the medical consensus. Bernays publicized the survey. Newspapers across the country ran the headline, 4,500 physicians urge heavy breakfast in order to improve the health of the American people. Many stories specifically mention bacon and eggs as the ideal hearty breakfast. Beechnut sales soared. Bernays documented this outcome himself. The 4,500 doctors were real. The survey was real. The science wasn't unreasonable. But the doctors who answered never knew their response would become a newspaper campaign for a bacon company. And the newspapers that ran the story never disclosed who had commissioned the survey. The client was invisible. The experts were genuine. The conclusion served the client's interests. And nobody lied. That was the method. Bernays called it borrowed authority. Find the institution the public trusts. Ask it the question whose answer you already need. Publish the result. Disappear. In 1929, George Washington Hill, president of the American Tobacco Company, had a different problem. Women were a largely untapped market for cigarettes, but smoking in public was taboo for women. The social barrier was real. The female market was enormous. Hill hired Bernays. Bernays consulted a psychoanalyst named Dr. A. Brill, who argued that in the unconscious mind, a cigarette could represent independence, a defiance of social control. Bernays took that analysis and made it into an event. He had his secretary, Bertha Hunt, approach young women in New York and invite them to a demonstration during the Easter Sunday parade on Fifth Avenue. He instructed Hunt to present herself as a women's rights advocate. She was not. She was following Bernays' instructions. He briefed the press in advance. He told reporters to expect women to light cigarettes as torches of freedom. On April 1st, 1929, women lit cigarettes during the Easter parade. The New York Times ran the headline, "Group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom." Neither Bernays nor American Tobacco appeared in a single press report. A 2015 academic study, based on original newspaper coverage and Bernays' scrapbooks at the Library of Congress, found that the immediate press impact was smaller and less celebratory than Bernays later claimed. He was a skilled self-promoter, and some of his stories grew in the retelling. But the event was real. The concealment was real. And what the event demonstrated mattered more than what it immediately caused. He hadn't told women to smoke. He had staged a moment in which smoking appeared to be an act of defiance, a symbol of freedom. The women in the parade were expressing real frustration with real inequality. The press was covering a real event. He had simply arranged the conditions so that all of those real things pointed in the direction his client needed. He called it a pseudo-event, a real occurrence, staged specifically to generate genuine news coverage. The event was not fabricated. The news was engineered. The cigarettes were real. The defiance was real. The tobacco company, invisible. It wasn't limited to food and cigarettes. When Procter & Gamble wanted children to engage with soap, Bernays organized a nationwide soap carving competition. He provided the judges. He generated the press coverage. Ivory soap became something children voluntarily sought out, not because parents insisted, but because a competition had made it interesting. The product was incidental. The activity was the point. Stage an event, generate news. Attach the product to something the public already values. Let the client stay out of the story. By the early 1950s, Bernays was hired by one of the most powerful companies in the Western Hemisphere. The United Fruit Company controlled vast agricultural territories across Central America. In Guatemala, it held land, railways, and port facilities, and an influence over national politics that went far beyond ordinary commerce. In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz was elected president of Guatemala. His land reform program would redistribute idle agricultural land, including large portions of United Fruit's holdings, to landless peasants. United Fruit framed it as communism. They hired Bernays. He provided American journalists with reports and briefings that portrayed Arbenz as a Soviet agent and Guatemala as a communist foothold in the hemisphere. He built front organizations that appeared to be independent news sources. He shaped the information environment in which American politicians and journalists understood, or misunderstood, what was happening in Guatemala. After Bernays' death in 1995, the Library of Congress made public 53 boxes of his United Fruit papers. Those documents detail, in his own correspondence, his behind-the-scenes maneuvering to frame a democratic land reform movement as a geopolitical threat. Bernays ran the propaganda campaign. The CIA executed the coup. In June 1954, Arbenz resigned. A CIA-backed government took power. Arbenz blamed the United States and United Fruit in his final radio broadcast, before it was jammed. Guatemala entered decades of military rule and civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the conflict that followed. Bernays later noted with some bitterness that United Fruit was being treated worse than the communists, as antitrust investigations in Washington began to threaten the company's American operations. The method had worked. The consequences were left for someone else to live with. Looking across every campaign, the breakfast survey, the Easter parade, the soap competition, the Guatemala briefings, the same tools appear. Borrowed authority. Find the expert the public trusts. Ask the question whose answer you already need. Publish the result. Pseudo-events. Stage a real occurrence designed to generate genuine news coverage. The event is not fabricated. The news is engineered. Third-party fronts. Create organizations that appear to be independent advocates. They are not independent. They work for the client. Symbolic framing. Never sell the product. Sell what the product means. Cigarettes become freedom. Bacon becomes health. A land reform movement becomes communism. Concealed clientship. The client never appears in the coverage. The expert speaks for themselves. The story runs without attribution. The product is consumed. And somewhere, the client counts the money. Bernays wrote all 5 into his books. He used all 5 on every major client, and he was proud of every one of them. He didn't think this was wrong. He thought it was how democracy worked. The public couldn't evaluate information without guidance. Someone had to organize that guidance. Better that it be done intelligently by professionals who understood the group mind than left to chance. He argued this openly in a book called Propaganda, published in 1928. The industries in our other documentaries didn't invent these methods. When the tobacco industry hired doctors to endorse cigarettes in the 1940s, that was borrowed authority. Bernays had documented the technique 2 decades earlier after working with American Tobacco himself. When the Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard researchers to clear sugar and implicate fat in the 1960s and never disclosed who funded the study, that was concealed clientship. Bernays had written it into a textbook. The early endorsements that Bayer's heroin received from respected medical publications revealed the same vulnerability Bernays would later exploit. Public trust can be borrowed, credibility can be rented, and once it is, the product behind it becomes very difficult to question. Bernays didn't teach these industries to behave this way, but he named the method, systematized it, and proved it worked at scale. His books were available, the case studies were public. What came after him applied the same techniques, with bigger clients and higher stakes. Different clients, different products, different decades, same playbook. Edward Bernays died in 1995. He was 103 years old. He had watched everything he built become so standard that no one called it Bernays anymore. They called it communications, public affairs, strategic messaging, earned media. They gave the techniques new names and taught them in business schools without mentioning where they came from. In his later years, he said he regretted one application of his work: the tobacco industry. Once the evidence on cigarettes became impossible to ignore. Not the method, not the philosophy, just that particular client. The technique, he believed until the end, was sound. The most unsettling thing about Edward Bernays isn't that he concealed his clients. It's that he wrote down exactly what he was doing, openly, under his own name, in 1928. And what he described has been practiced across politics, business, media, and marketing ever since. He didn't control anyone's mind. He didn't need to. He controlled the information environment, the experts who spoke, the journalists who wrote, the events that generated news, the symbols that made products feel like values. The public chose freely. They just chose from a menu Bernays had designed. Modern propaganda doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like a doctor's recommendation. It feels like a news story. It feels like a grassroots movement. It feels like a choice you made